Right. So good morning, colleagues. Absolutely delighted to see you all here registered for this particular webinar. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you on the behalf of the Academy of Science of South Africa. And what is so interesting about this particular relationship is that I started way back with INASP. I think it was 2002 and 2003. And I think in the careers of both ASSAf and INASP, it has changed and it has put on many coats and take off many coats. And it is certainly taking a very particular course at the moment for both organizations. So as said, this relationship has been going way back. And it was 2 years ago at the Science Forum South Africa, where we met up again with INASP and decided that we should start walking a road together again. So I'm very pleased, Alice, and your other colleagues, that we took up all the ropes again to start with this new collaboration, and was absolutely delighted to participate in the questionnaire, which was quite difficult, I must say. But certainly you applied your mind and you applied so many lenses to actually pick up on the discussion that we will have this morning. So thank you very much for this opportunity, for the collaboration, and for our participants joining, and for all our speakers that so willingly agreed to participate. And I'm handing over now for the formal welcome then from INASP. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. And yeah, very happy to be here and to be continuing this collaboration together by putting on this webinar, where we're hopefully kind of joining together our thinking on this topic and trying to kind of really increase the conversation and increase the dialogue around how we can continue to advance open access. So I'm here very much in terms of presenting the evidence that INASP has been developing alongside partners to kind of frame the discussion that's going to follow. But I will now hand over to Leanne Jones from FCDO based in Pretoria in South Africa to provide the moderation for the session and introduce us. And thank you. We'll proceed from there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great. Good morning, all. Thanks so much, Alice and Susan. And really nice to hear that story, actually, Susan, of that journey, your personal journey working with INASP and, coming together at Science Forum as well. So thank you, everyone. So let me start by thanking ASSAf and INASP for hosting us in this really important discussion this morning, and to all of you for taking part and taking the time out of your day to join us. My name is Leanne Jones. So as Alice mentioned, I'm based at the High Commission in Pretoria, and I lead the UK government's work on science and research across the continent. So we have teams based in Nairobi covering East Africa. We have teams in West Africa, in both Accra and in Nigeria, and our team in Southern Africa in Pretoria. One of the big goals of our work is around strengthening UK-Africa science partnership, and part of that as well is looking at research and innovation system strengthening across the continent. So with that in mind, one of our big objectives and big work programs is setting up alongside NRF, South Africa NRF, and Canada's IDRC was the Science Granting Council's initiative, a really amazing program that we're really proud of being one of those forefathers in setting up that program. And it's great that we'll have so many of SGCs represented here on this call today. We've also been working with INASP on the work around how do we leverage science diplomacy to progress the work on open access and really take forward and actually get some action and progress, leveraging our networks across science diplomacy. So really pleased to be here today and to moderate this panel. I will introduce, just in terms of the program, so everybody is aware. So we'll start with presentation from Alice on the work that Susan mentioned. Thanks to everybody who inputted into the studies and the surveys. We'll then move into the moderated panel discussion, and we'll have 40 minutes with me asking some questions from our panel members, and then we'll open up for the audience. So please, if you've got questions along that time, there is the Q&A function in Skype. If you can't see that across the bottom, I know for me, I can't see that right now. If you just click on the bottom more with the 3 dots, you should see in that list the Q&A. If you've got comments throughout the session, do add them into the chat function. And of course, when we come to the Q&A, please do put on your cameras, put up your hand. We'd love to hear from you directly. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into their full illustrious careers and the detailed biographies. You will have seen that on the screen earlier this morning, as well as you can access them or stalk them on LinkedIn even better and kind of connect with them that way. But I think Alice has introduced herself, but just to make sure everybody's aware, so we'll have from INASP, Dr. Alice Chadwick El Ali. She'll be presenting. Alice has been with INASP since January this year as the research lead and project manager for the Strengthening Science Diplomacy and ODA Policy and Global Research Publishing Reform project. Quite a mouthful, Alice. Then we'll move on to the panel, and we have Dr. Martin Ongul, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Uganda National Council for Science and Technology, and Dr. Ongul leads the Science Granting Council's initiative work in Uganda. We also have Dr. Thomas Songu, the Director of ICT at Nanjala University in Sierra Leone. And Dr. Songu is also the Chief Executive Officer of the Sierra Leone Research and Education Network. We have Dr. Nokutula Mchunu, a Director in the International Grants and Partnerships Division of the South Africa National Research Foundation. And last but no means least, we will have Susan on the panel as well. So Susan Veldsman, Director of the Scholarly Publication Unit at the Academy of Science for South Africa. So without further ado, I think we should get into the presentation. And I'm handing over to Alice to please present.
Thanks, Leanne. I'm just checking everyone can see my screen. I'm just going to go into present mode. Is that clear for everyone? Can just confirm.
Yes, we've started with the slide, the problem. I assume that's the one to start with.
That's where we're starting. Thanks very much, Leanne, and looking forward to the panel discussion that follows. So in my presentation today, I'm going to draw upon two pieces of evidence that INASP has recently produced together with partners. One is a review of Africa's research publishing landscape, examining journals, publishers, and the infrastructure behind them. That was led by my colleague Nora Ndege, who's actually on leave this week, otherwise she'd be presenting that work herself. And that's available on Open Research Africa. And the second is the piece that Susan alluded to, a review of open access policy options for research funders. So I'm going to try and draw out from these pieces of evidence what's of interest and relevance for research funders and science granting councils in Africa to further advance open access publishing on the continent. I'm going to briefly talk about the problem. I'm sure many of us all together on this call are very aware of it, but really what we're trying to do at INASP is advance research publishing as a fundamental global challenge that's kind of holding back progress and advancement to try and get the momentum behind advancing change in this area. So still 55 to 70% of research remains locked behind paywalls, which is limiting that global access and the use and uptake in policy and practice. And this erodes public trust through the closed research systems, reducing support for science and science policies, but also creates barriers to research progress as so many are excluded from global scientific discourse, hindering innovation, especially for the vast majority who don't have access to institutional subscriptions to access that research. And open access publishing was sort of meant to be the answer to this problem, right? But in many instances, we've seen that problem of pay to access has been replaced by the problem of pay to publish open access, which again is very exclusionary and limits the evidence and discourse, and continues to limit the evidence and discourse that informs global science. And in our recent review, we reviewed the 21 development-focused research funders, what the estimates of what they spent on article processing charges to achieve open access over just in 1 year in 2023, and it was between $74 and $81 million. And this is despite there being actually a decline in progress towards open access in the same period. So it's a very expensive system that is still not achieving the full open access that we need to advance global development and research and science discourse more broadly. And for African researchers, they're currently tied into this international scholarly communication system that does not work for them or their institutions. And when we think about those article processing charges, with a median article processing charge of around $3,000, which could be 6 months' pay for a Nigerian researcher, and then top journals can charge up to $12,000 as well. And while we're probably all aware there are kind of waiver systems for article processing charges that are, operate between 50 to 100% of the cost, these are often still not sufficient to make publication affordable, and are also onerous and complicated to apply for, and which continues to deter publication. And it's also not a sustainable system in terms of operating on a waiver system for having access to open access publication venues. So as part of understanding the landscape, we conducted this piece of work that was mapping the African publishing landscape, and trying to kind of understand what the journal infrastructure and architecture was currently like, in order to be able to kind of understand where to prioritize investments in open access publishing, and where the kind of current strengths are as well. So there's obviously limitations in terms of the data sources that we had access to, which can be found in the article itself, which I'll share in the chat later. But we found at least 1,790 active academic journals, which were hosted by around 1,169 publishers. So what this shows is that most publishers publish only a single journal, and that's often within a university department or a professional society. And actually 70% of these publishers and journals are concentrated in just 3 African countries, that is Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. So we also looked at other aspects of the journals that were available to us in the data set, in terms of like the disciplinary focus, and actually found a significant disciplinary focus on social sciences, which leaves much more limited options for publication in African journals in STEM subjects or agriculture and technology and engineering. And in terms of assessing the multilingual aspect of journals, although there were many examples that were multilingual, 67% of the journals were publishing only in English, which is obviously limiting the discourse and discussion that can be contributing to those journals. And the other aspect, obviously very pertinent to this conversation, that we looked at was access models. So for this element, we only had access to the 667 African journals in the Directory of Open Access Journals. For these journals, we can found, as you can see on the screen, that 65% of them operated under what gets called a sort of gold open access model. So that is when an article processing charge is levied, whereas 35% operated under so-called diamond, which is where there's no fee to publish or to access the research. But what's I think really important to recognize is that from those 65% that did use an APC model, the median article processing charge was $250. So obviously aiming more at cost recovery rather than profit. So this kind of shows there's a kind of ongoing experiment in terms of trying to find the right balance between openness, cost recovery, and quality in terms of the model of open access amongst journals on the continent. So what, from this kind of publishing landscape review, some of these kind of challenges that are on the screen now I've already alluded to, but I also wanted to draw attention to, I think, the bottom 2 really on the screen, because I think they're kind of the space also where research funding organizations and science granting councils can also start have influence and also kind of seek to advance the agenda. So one's around limited indexing and global visibility. So one of those challenges is in terms of whether the African journals are indexed in so the big kind of databases like Scopus or Web of Science. And obviously that kind of puts African research off the radar of people who are looking at international research outputs. And the second point is around external dependency and loss of ownership. So in recent years, from the review we conducted, we found that some African journals have partnered with or been taken over by large international publishing companies such as Elsevier, Springer, Taylor & Francis. And obviously this has improved some elements of visibility and provided technical expertise, but it's also raised concerns about ownership and data control, especially in the long term. So what we moving kind of shifting a bit to thinking about the second piece of work that we produced, we're also kind of trying to understand what the role potentially for open access policies or mandates is in providing a framework for advancing reform in this area. So as I previously mentioned, there's been a lot of money invested by research funders in terms of spending money on article processing charges to advance open access, but this hasn't really solved the problem in terms of transitioning to a full open access for the research related to the research that they funded. So how can these policies be strengthened, and is this one lever for further advancing change? So to support this process, we've created a framework for assessing the impact of different open access policy options on research, equity, and resourcing. And this covers the kind of two core elements of open access in terms of timely access and ability to reuse. And they're the ones that I'm going to focus a bit more on in a bit more depth on, to kind of explore what we found in terms of the impact of different policy positions. But really what this framework can help us do is provide a tool for assessing either an institution's current open access policy position or their intended future position, and kind of trying to understand sort of trade-offs between different impacts that might have from those policy positions. So moving to the realm of access. So we looked at 3 different options in terms of access. One was requiring immediate access to all articles, so not allowing for any kind of embargo period imposed by a journal. The other was looking at various different lengths of embargoes, which are quite standard, such as a 6-month embargo or a 12-month embargo. And obviously the concern around this is the timely access to research if there's an embargo period, in terms of people having access to those research findings in an open access format. And apologies because the charts are a little bit hard to read, but basically the green on the charts is sort of where there's really good impact, and the other areas is when it's kind of reduced or negative impact. And what we found through this review is that requiring that immediate access has very positive impacts on research in terms of timely access and collaboration and inclusion. And then as the embargo period increases, those positive impacts are reduced. But the other element that we looked at that is in the full review paper and might be of interest, especially for the discussion, is around preprints as potentially a route to providing the most timely access to research outputs, but they're also being needing to be further developments in terms of recognizing them in research assessment, etc., for increased uptake. So moving to the next area that I'll look at before I kind of summarize the recommendations and kind of discussion points, I guess, which will hopefully lead to the panel discussion. So we also looked at reuse. So this is around licensing of articles, and we looked at the most open Creative Commons licensing, the Creative Commons licensing that only allows for non-commercial use, and also having no licensing requirements. And within these different options in terms of an open access policy, we found obviously that the ability to reuse is very positive if you've got the most open form of licensing, and then reducing slightly. And then if there's no licensing requirements, you can see the red on the final chart. There's obviously a much more negative impact on ability to reuse research if there isn't the correct licensing in place. So obviously this is kind of quite technical in terms of the details of the open access policy itself, but what I wanted to draw together for this discussion was what this might mean, along with the findings from the review, for research funding institutions in Africa in terms of advancing open access. So there's obviously a need reflected by the findings from the review for African-led open access publishing solutions. Many of these already exist. It's more about amplifying and supporting existing initiatives to enable researchers to publish research relevant to their context, to inform policy making and correcting those imbalances in knowledge contributions to global knowledge systems. And this is especially relevant in the context of artificial intelligence and large language models, which are currently likely being trained on content that does not reflect African perspectives. So there's need to work together to develop and strengthen shared infrastructure, repositories, digital platforms, and also indexing systems as well to improve that discoverability and integration of African journals. And a key role for policymakers in terms of trying to get it on their agenda to ensure that there's investment in this as a kind of issue in terms of access to research and evidence for development as well. And then I guess returning more to the open access policy level, there's enabling policies that can be put in place to support this. So one is around adopting open access policies and mandates themselves and how they can drive change by sharing expectations around how research is shared. For example, requiring immediate access or requiring licensing that allows reuse. But there's also an interaction with research assessment as well. And supporting a more holistic view of quality research within funders and research institutions to move beyond to move beyond the kind of where research is published to a more holistic assessment of quality. However, I think beyond a specific open access policy, there's also space for institutions to have more of a policy position on open access or open research more broadly that can provide that framework for prioritization and investment in open access publishing. So this is just a kind of flavor of some of the insights that have come out of this work, but I'm now going to hand over to the panel, the esteemed panel, to provide their much more expert considerations of this issue and how the work that they're already doing to advance this agenda and where they think there's space for more progress. So I'll hand back to you, Leanne. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Alice, and thanks to you and all of the INASP team in putting together the research and the findings. There's a lot of different areas we could dig into there, and I'm sure there's lots of comments in the chat. So if you have the chance, Alice or the team, just to dig into those, see what we can answer. Can I ask all the panel members to please put on their video so you can join us here? Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Thomas. Have we got Martin? Thanks, Knox. Great. If anyone can give me a nudge on who we're missing from the panel.
Can we just check in with Maputi, please, Leanne? She's keeping tags on who is here and who is not here. Maputi,
great.
Dr. Martin Ongol, it's not here, unless if maybe he joined under a different name.
Okay. Great. So we'll kick off without Martin for now, and hopefully if he joins, we can bring him into the discussion. I mean, Alice, just a reflection from a international funders perspective, looking at that staggering amount of money that is still spent on APCs, up to 80 million in 1 year. And really, if we're looking at a situation with, reducing international development funding, particularly even, development funding for research as well, we really want to make the most of the money that's going in to make sure that we're actually, addressing the ambitions that we collectively have on open access. So how to get the most out of that money that's going in is a really important takeaway from me. I think we will start with the speakers to start with some introductory comments. So we will go to each person. We're going to try and keep these short so we have time for the actual detailed panel discussion. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Songu. If you could please share with us what steps your institution is taking to advocate for open science, open access and publishing in your country and more broadly across the continent. Over to you, Thomas.
Good day, everyone. I'm Dr. Songu. I'm the director of ICT for one of the universities and also the CEO for the Sierra Leone Research and Education Network. In Sierra Leone, since we joined the Science Granting Council, much has been done with regards to open science. In fact, we have taken 7 steps in terms of developing a national open science policy. We are one of the few West African countries that have done that. We started with institutional analysis, wherein we got funding from WACREN and LipSense to do an open science symposium, really to scan the STI and open science ecosystem to know their understanding on that subject. It was quite fruitful. It resulted into the establishment of a task force, which was really set up by the Minister of Technical and Higher Education to develop a draft open science policy. That was drafted within 2 months, and thereafter, we had a session to validate it, wherein we were able to get funding from FCDO to support the validation, with consultants coming from Europe to support the validation. And thereafter, it was actually sent to the minister to get a national accent to make sure that there is a national ownership. That was established. And then we also got some seed funding from FCDO to sensitize the STI ecosystem, universities, the public-private sectors in terms of open science. So that sensitization has been done. And in fact, sometime this month, we are now sort of going to look at monitoring in terms of how it's being implemented within universities and the STI ecosystem. So we are pretty good on that. It's very much motivating on that. In terms of open access, to be quite honest, open access is not new to Sierra Leone. We actually started in 2015 through INASP. You know, we were introduced by open access. Training we are done by folks like John and others who are in INASP as we still speak. They did training, leadership engagement. We did some the African Journal training in Ghana, but then when COVID came, everything slowed down. In 2023, again, we started, in fact, with support from, the FCDO and the WACREN. There's so much focus on implementing open access. All of the public universities have now introduced some element of open access, wherein there is a need for an institutional repositories. In fact, we are currently promoting that. We are using this space as institutional repositories. And we also have link with Research for Life, which was initially initiated by INASP, but now in 2024, the Sierra Leone Research and Education Network signed an agreement with Research for Life for Country Connect. What that means really, within the higher education sphere, we are promoting access to e-books, e-journals, e-articles in various disciplines, spanning from technology to law to agriculture and health. So the sensitization is ongoing. In most of the universities in Sierra Leone are conscious of that. And we are now driving towards setting up publishing platforms. In fact, that's the current engagement we are in. As you may be aware, Sierra Leone has just been connected to the regional network, which is the WACREN. So within the HCI ecosystem, connectivity has been a major problem for open access repositories. So we are now in that process of getting the equipment, getting the institutions connected, because building the infrastructure for open science, we strongly believe is our major challenge. So when we are approaching our donors, FCDO and the like, the granting council, our focus is really getting funding to build the infrastructure for open science so that the connectivity and access to scholarly resources can be accomplished. So I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Songu. I mean, super impressive. You've been working on this since in 2015, starting with INASP again, and all the work to lead into the open science policy. So congratulations on doing that. Knox, I might turn to you next, if that's okay. So obviously you've got a role and responsibility covering Southern Africa, but have, you know, a far more extensive reach across the continent too. So same question, a bit of an intro, but share with us what steps your institution is taking to advance open access publishing in your country and beyond in the continent. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Alice, for such wonderful work that you've done. Of course, led by Nora, although she's not here. I think it is, although our cost, of course, that the African journals are supporting a bit lower, I think there should be a reasonable way to support open access. So I think the discussions within the NRF has moved not to open access, it's supporting equitable open access models. I think this is where because this is why we are in trouble, because we discuss open access. Previously, we forgot about the equitable part, and this is why we have such high cost. So I think, to be brief on the introductory remarks, I think I will touch on two programs that we've been currently engaged, which are showing promise. I don't want to discuss doom today. I want to discuss promises that I think there seems to be a movement. So South Africa hosted the G20, and during the CISA, which is the Science Advice Roundtable, the topic was on open science, but more focused on how do we make sure that the knowledge system and the systems that support it are equitable. So there was on all the G20 countries plus the invited ones, which were 3. There is strong support. So in the outcomes statement, there's strong support to do that. So this is one now outcomes document that we are trying to see how we can operationalize it. Now, moving on from the government side, I think I will discuss a little bit more, is that we have the GRC, which some of you may not be familiar with. This is the Global Research Councils, where all the funders, nearly 100, kind of convene and form this peer-to-peer platform. And the discussion of the topic for this year, which we will hold an annual meeting in May in Thailand, is on open science. And open science in this discussion paper is divided in 5 sessions. And the first one is, of course, how to make sure that open access is situated in social justice and is equitable. So as I'm joining this meeting, I'm in Zimbabwe, and we have all the granting councils in the continent that are part of the GRC, which is about close to 20. We are discussing what will be the stance of the funders at GRC next year in this particular question. So there seems to be a strong movement to try and encourage funders on how we can come together now and fund the system instead of funding the publishers. Because as long as we're kind of paying for something on the top instead of funding the actual system, we will always have this kind of a problem. Of course, the good thing about the GRC is that it already has an outcome statement on responsible research assessment. So I tried throughout this discussion this week on how we can marry these two in order to support this idea that we want to propose in all the global funders that are part of the GRC in 2026. So I'm really hoping that we could fund the infrastructure as funders. But as Alice touched on, I think the biggest lever is research assessment. And research assessment is kind of connected to research culture. And this is where the researchers, not just government, can kind of play a role in making sure that we drive towards equitable open access models. But as we go through this conversation, I really also want us to think about the idea that we are over-publishing and we are creating this problem by over-publishing. So we need to think of how we disseminate knowledge that doesn't need to come as an article form, and how we drive towards social impact than just academic impact. Thank you. I will stop there.
Thanks, Knox. Yeah, really appreciate that. And I think then the follow-on from, please do leave your camera on. We'd love to keep your face in the meeting. The follow-on from that is, not just driving the research outcomes for socioeconomic impact, but then, feeding that back into the research assessment process, and how do you get funding through demonstrating that impact is something we're really interested in from FCDO, particularly looking at Southern Africa. So great to talk about that at a later point. Dr. Ongul, thank you for joining us. Welcome. So we're just going around the houses for introductory comments from the panel members. So we did give you an intro in terms of your background before when we started, but just for the question for you, if you could share with us what steps your institution is taking to advance open access publishing in your country, and then the impact across the continent more broadly. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jones. And as introduced, I'm Martin Ongol, Deputy Executive Secretary, Uganda National Council for Science and Technology. I joined UNCST in 2020, and at that time, INASP was already having a project with UNCST. And then we started working on the National Research Repository of Uganda. And we realized that that was one of the key starting points of UNCST getting into the open access, open science field. But then in 2023, we had a meeting with Joy Owango from TCC, where we discussed about UNCST as the lead science agency in Uganda, making sure that within the Uganda's research landscape, we get into open access. And then at that stage, internally, we had a lot of debate. Should we come with a policy? Should we do capacity building? There were about 6 or so priority areas that we came up with. Then the first step that we did was actually to make sure that, first of all, we make sure that our stakeholders get to know what is open access. Of course, UNESCO country office was already supporting and promoting. And then we went and engaged with the Ministry of Education. Of course, it controls all the universities and the like. So from there, actually, we succeeded in meeting the Minister of State for Higher Education, which is in charge of universities in Uganda. And that helped a lot in reaching the universities. So with that, we did a needs assessment study for Uganda. What is open access? This is how UNCST understands open access. This is how UNESCO understands open access. This is how Europe and the global scientific community. But for Ugandans, what does it mean for open access? Also trying to look at the barriers and drivers and the like. So we developed a UNCST institutional policy, which now actually it's being adopted as a national open science access policy. Then after we developed that policy, we presented it to our council, that is equivalent to our board of around 33 eminent professionals drawn from academia, industry, and government. And it was one item that was very much supported. Then what we did, we launched the open access, and we did this in conjunction with a private university in Uganda, ISBAT. And during that launch, we invited the government officials, and the government of Uganda has about 4 development priorities from this period 2025 to 2030, and they were talking of agriculture, tourism, mining, and then science, technology, and innovation. So when we brought the key policy makers on this area, then actually they realized that there was a very huge mismatch, especially in terms of the availability of open access data and the policy priorities in Uganda. And I think one of the strongest comments came from the tourism sector, where they're saying that there is a lot that the outputs of R&D, if put through open access, can help the private sector in the tourism industry, the policy makers and the like. And this was very much well taken up. And I can say that that has been very impactful, and UNCST has been invited for further engagements. And then in terms of impact, I can give one where the work that we did with INASP on setting up the National Repository of Uganda also yielded a very good outcomes, because what happened is that the downloads, the reads and the like from the National Research Repository, I think the highest, I checked the data about a month ago, the most popular research was on mental health, and then there was something on environment and sustainability. But again, UNCST is the National Clearing House for Research and Experimental Development in Uganda. And when we compared where are Ugandan researchers researching and where the demand is, we found out that there was a huge mismatch. For instance, mental health, and then sustainability, environment, and the like coming on top was quite different from the research which Ugandans are doing, which was mainly focused, of course, around medical. But then when you look at that, the medical areas, it's quite different from what is demanded. And then also on the government side, we are talking more of getting into manufacturing, value-added goods and services. But again, when we look at both our National Research Repository and then the research which is being conducted, it's quite different. And this has supported us to get into policy briefs, engage more with the government, and it's supporting the government on how they should design their funding, infrastructure, development priorities, and the like. But also, as a country, with UNCST being the lead institution, when we get to meet the funding community, we try to bring in these discussions in order to shape the designs of proposals or research calls. Thank you for the time being. Let me end here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ongul, and really impressive the way I really liked how you brought in the different line ministries and really demonstrated to them where that gap was and where the interest from them was in terms of engaging with the open access agenda. So thank you for that. Susan, I'll turn to you. And obviously the academies are going to take a slightly different role in the national research system. So it'd be interesting to hear from you around that role of academies in terms of open access. And how you engage with the SGCs in country, and both within South Africa and how you work collaboratively with other academies across the continent. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. As you've already alluded to, I am Susan Peltzman, the Director of the Scholarly Publishing Program at the Academy of Science of South Africa. Now, you rightly mentioned we are very different. We wear a very different hat. But we also sort of join all the forces in South Africa in terms of open science and open access. We have been involved in open access since the beginning years of ASSAf, which also dates back way to 2002, doing some prominent consensus studies on the subject and looking at the strategic planning of scholarly output in South Africa. So scholarly output in South Africa has been driven with a very particular mandate and a very particular policy and a drive within South Africa. And we can actually see it. South Africa publishes actually quite a lot. It has its unintended consequences, of course, but it is really the research output policy drives the research output in South Africa. So as said, everything we do is open. It's open accessible. Our own reports, all the work that we do, if there's a video recording, if we create data, if we publish a journal, if we do repositories, we adhere to all the open science, open access standards, international standards being in place, being Creative Commons licenses, providing open infrastructures, providing support in terms of journal publishing, book publishing, etc. So all the work that we've been doing have been driven by the open access mandate. If I can start perhaps the shortcoming within South Africa, and that is that our government has an open science framework lying there, and I'm being extremely critical, and please forgive me, participants, if I'm throwing huge rocks into massive bushes, but it is quite frustrating from where we stand as the Academy and trying to drive the open science agenda, because we need that very important hook on which we can sort of embed and ground our open science activities into. We need to plug into somewhere. And currently we're not plugging into a national open science framework or policy, whatever you want to call it. We've been promised that it will be put onto the table of the Parliament, and Cabinet will decide on it very soon, was the words to us. But in the absence of the national open science policy, we just decided that we as the Academy cannot just sit back and do all this work in this space, advocate, because that's all we do, for organizations, for publishers, for journal editors, for infrastructural organizations in South Africa to drive the open access, and there's just nothing that we can plug it into. So we have done our own open science ASSAf policy to indicate what exactly is it that we are standing for, what are we promoting. But saying that, it sort of recognizes already the draft, let's call it the draft open science framework of the government. Of course, we plug into the UNESCO recommendations. It is not in isolation that ASSAf actually created this open science policy for the work that we do. So I think that's very important. At least that is giving us direction. It gives us a policy that we can defend all our actions if we start wading into waters that people feel we shouldn't. We are very clear in terms of what are our intentions and to which level we will engage in these different sort of activities of open science, open access. We also advocate for open science, and not only open access. We advocate for a complete openness. And I think that's very important, because I think that was also the downfall of open access at the time, is because we were very narrowly minded, just looking at open access as such, but we should open up. So what are we doing as an academy to advocate, to promote, to train, and to make people aware of open science in the higher education sector, as well as research in general as such? Of course, we do provide advice to the Department of Higher Education and Training in terms of the research output policy, which drives the research agenda also in South Africa. We provide open infrastructures, namely the Sierra South Africa platform, where we have a hybrid model in terms of gold and diamond open access journals. And the reason for following through with a hybrid model is because of the absence of particular funding in South Africa to drive the open science agenda. On the Sierra South Africa platform, as well as our COLISA platform, which is funded by ASSAf, and through our National Treasury grant, is we also promote equity, multiple languages, and we encourage publishers to consider many ways to introduce our 11 languages in research output. It's free to access, it's free to be indexed on our Sierra South Africa platform, and above all, we also promote quality. We still think that that's a very important element of actually putting the journals onto the platform and providing it open accessible. Of course, we were the host of the S20, where we focused on climate change and human health. Although there's not large mentioning of open data, there is, in all the recommendations, there is the notion to promote and to support open data. You can imagine in the field of climate change and health, is that open data is becoming extremely important. We've also published a guideline alongside our POPIA Act, which is the Protection of Personal Information, which gives people that deals with personal information how they should do it, how they should curate it, how they should have a data management plan in place, and how they should collaborate. And if there's cross-border exchange of data, what should they do and what should they ensure? We know the problems in Africa when we start sharing data. All this data just spin out from Africa particularly. So this guideline is to guide the researchers, is how to protect the information whilst they're sharing it actually. As said, we do a lot of training and advocacy among young emerging researchers, making them aware of many pitfalls within the within sort of the ambit of the research output policy. As said, it drives research output, but it also have unintended consequences like predatory publishing or unethical publishing practices. So we also make them aware that where you move into the space of openness, one has to be very careful of your actions. And within this whole trend of AI is how to deal with that and how to use it responsible and ethical, of course. Research assessment, we do not necessarily go into that space because we feel that the NRF is actually the organization to drive that particular agenda, but we do advocate for the reformation of the research assessment as such. We think that is as much as we can do. And of course, research repositories, that we will talk a little bit later about repositories as such. ASSAf also has its own repository, etc. But when we have a second round of our discussions, I will particularly focus on repositories and share perhaps the challenges that we have there. So that is really in a nutshell what we're doing. We also have quite a large Pan-African footprint. We're a member of the Network of Academies of Sciences in Kenya. We play also quite a vital role in establishing academies across Africa. That is one of our biggest roles that we have to play on the continent. And of course, collaboration is core for the work in ASSAf. You know, we only have, our secretariat is small. We are about 30 people. So we have to rely very heavily on our members and of course on all our bilaterals and our collaborative efforts to take this message forward. Thank you very much, Leanne. I think I'll just stop there and we can continue later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate those comments. And as you say, we hope we'll get into a bit more around the assessment and repositories discussion a little bit later. But I wanted to pick up on your point around that challenge in terms of moving policy forward and actually implementation and approvals of policy. And we've had, obviously, from Sierra Leone and Uganda, some really successful stories around open access, open science policies being approved. We heard a great kind of very similar process in terms of, you know, the institutional analysis across the countries, and then those processes for onboarding different organizations to align with that vision. I wonder, Dr. Songo, Dr. Ongul, if there are, if you have reflections of the challenges as well. What was really difficult in that process? So, you know, some of those barriers, and not just to developing and getting engagement from other parts of government to align with that vision, but then now moving forward in terms of implementation of the open science policy within your country. What does that look like, and what are those challenges, and yeah, what the roles and responsibilities of your organizations are? Can I start with you, Dr. Songo?
Well, thank you. I think, as I mentioned earlier, for us in Sierra Leone, the implementation itself, policy processes, we got support from the Ministry of Technical Education. And because we have been introduced to open access through INASP since 2015, so it has been really interesting. But since even 2015 today, one of the issues we have is the infrastructure for open science or open access. Most of the universities are really coming and playing dual role. I'm the ICT director at the university. I also support the other universities. At the same time, I'm also part of the CEO for the RAIN in Sierra Leone, and also I work with the National Science, Technology and Innovation Council. Our biggest challenge really is the infrastructure for open science. And in most cases in the past, funders have not been concentrating on the issue of procurement of equipment, etc. So it's been challenging, particularly for universities in this part. They have budgetary constraints, and building those infrastructure, that initial expenditure has been our biggest challenge. You bring all this, say for instance, Research for Life. All the universities have accounts to Research for Life, but the comment, because I normally have sensitization workshop every 2-3 months, the biggest issue is internet connectivity. Yes, you have Research for Life, online resources, national repositories. We have deployed, most of the public universities have actually deployed this space for as open access national repositories. And we are now sort of asking them for us to establish institutional platforms for publications and also a national platform. But connectivity is quite critical. So I think that is the biggest challenge. And I think going forward, the momentum, I mean, most of the West African countries are now connected to WACRAN. The institutions and the government should work with the NRENs. If we work with them, because the cost of internet is surmountable in this part of the world, we are in the mobile providers, the universities cannot afford. But working alongside with NREN, this is the Sierra Leone story, the NREN, ensuring that universities are connected to NREN, and also creating that technical space to make sure that we improve on campus network infrastructure. You may have a huge bandwidth sitting on a campus, but if their infrastructure in terms of how it is connected to buildings, to classrooms, to faculties, is a major challenge. But then I think funders should start working closely through the NRENs to support the universities, because they don't have this the technical abilities, they don't have the funding is not there. So if we really want to promote open science, open access within universities and in the research ecosystem, let's try and build the infrastructure for open science by working with the NRENT. My colleague in Uganda, who is my best friend, I mean, we collaborate. We are doing collaborative research. I know the Ugandan NREN is one of the most mature in the region. So collaboration with NRENs is really pivotal to make sure that we realize the potential of open science and open access. I stop here for now.
Great, thanks, Dr. Songo. Dr. Ongo, I wonder if there's any addition you want to add. I assume very similar challenges in terms of connectivity and infrastructure across the institutions, but any other additional barriers that you've faced in terms of actual implementation of the next stage for the open science policy?
Yeah, sure. And of course, my colleague has already talked about infrastructure. And of course, one element of the infrastructure is the data warehousing system, especially now that the data repositories are quite important. But the rest, I agree with what my colleague has mentioned. And then there is also the legal and the legislatory framework within Uganda that sometimes misunderstood by our stakeholders, especially when it comes to data protection policy and IP laws. Some of the scientists and stakeholders then say, okay, open access will just make me lose my own IP or so. So we are trying to educate them along those areas, really how you can still move on with open science, meanwhile also taking into consideration data protection laws and IP laws. So that's one area that we are engaging with stakeholders. Then also there are some universities that are not very much willing to make sure that their data is easily accessible by other stakeholders into the ecosystem. And then I think what we are now trying to look at in the near future is the interoperability of the different IT systems that are managing the open access libraries, especially the repositories. And then what we have also realized is that within the government entities and many other stakeholders in the ecosystem, there is a lot of information which has not been digitalized still in paper form. And some of those are very useful. And that's also something that we are trying to think about. There's a lot of historical work that is, if digitalized, that could help. We are collaborating with the Research and Education Network in Uganda. And actually, what UNCST has done, we have signed an MOU and we have told them to help in managing the ORCID, the researcher identification system. And that is helping us to get buy-in the sense that researchers are very happy to see their visibility, collaborations, and the like. And through Reno also, we have developed a portable solar-based router wireless system, and that also helps to reach in the remote areas within the country. But I would say, in summary, there are two main things, I think: infrastructure and then the legal and the legislative environment that also needs to be navigated. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Ongul. And I recognize, I like your concept around this as a part of like education with your colleagues around these legal frameworks of what it means in terms of open science, open access, not necessarily huge revising the legislative frameworks around data and IP. So that's really helpful. Let's move on to the discussion around the sort of recognition and the sort of research assessments. And this is an area which I don't understand necessarily. I'm not a technical person, you would have guessed, I'm sure, but my area in history is mostly in the policy frameworks, so I'm really interested in how we actually move things forward through policy. But this issue around preprints in research assessment and what the value of that might be in terms of really pushing the open access agenda. I'll start with you, maybe Knox, and I'm sure you've got thoughts, but obviously from the work that Alice presented, there seems to be an opportunity. What do you think the actions the science granting councils, other funding institutions, etc., can take to support reforms to research assessment to advance open access, particularly thinking around these reprints and preprints, and other opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. I think there's a lot that was said by my fellow panelists that we need to pull the threads a little bit and go on, but I will go to the question that you asked me. I think, as I said before, I think of open access. I'm going to try to stay on, because once we go into the open science policy and open science, it has its own many things. So I'm just going to try and stick to this. I think of it as it has two main players that are there. Yes, you have the funders that are kind of, I can group them with government, and we are together, we can discuss. Then you have the researchers, which is the research culture. And I think the research assessment is very much driven by researchers than the funders. Yes, we make the rules, but when we we ask the panels to come and review proposals and give us feedback on the expert, it's still the academics that come. And when you go back to the universities, the promotional policies that exist within universities, government and funders do not dictate that. They are kind of an internal policy. So this proxy of publishing, of impact factors that have been given is part of this research assessment, which then takes away, then when you start talking about preprints and diamond and repositories, it becomes like a difficult thing because they don't see a number on this output, and then in their mind they cannot assess the quality according to them, and if you can give research assessment. So I think for me, I'm a big proponent as I slowly move away from being an academic on sharing the knowledge. That is the most important thing. You share the knowledge, and all the other parts, and preprints allows you to do that. And as we've seen with the growth of internet and with AI, we've seen that whatever we are thinking that it is peer reviewed, it isn't really. It's just two people looked at the paper and they decide that yes, it's ready. And this is the reality. We are making a decision that the paper is quality based on two people making the decision. Meanwhile, in the preprint section, people, yes, they have to follow rigor, but they put it out there for the community to decide if it's worth use or not. So I think these are the two things that we really need to decide. And this is now the community of that particular discipline that can decide how they review this. And we've seen the growth of preprint when we had COVID, where all this supposedly rigor suddenly became not important because we are more focused on getting the knowledge. As long as we are more focused on getting the knowledge, kind of the good papers would rise to the top. The community will review and say, this is not a good paper, this is a good paper, and you kind of move from there. So, and I think when Susan started talking about repository, they have their role, they may have challenges, and it kind of ties back to what Thomas and Martin were talking about, and Ina also supported in the group, is that Africa, we don't have large amount to fund infrastructure. How can we use the current infrastructure that exists within the NRENs, within countries that have able infrastructure, to combine and support universities and researchers to build an infrastructure that can work in disseminating knowledge? So, for example, in Latin America, where they have constrained resources like us, they have had two large initiatives that have supported publishing. This is one is Cielo, which ASSAf also adapted for South Africa, where we have our own Cielo, which had brought down publishing in those journals relatively low. So, and it's accepted within the Latin America to publish in there. Then you have what is hosted in Mexico, Red League, which is totally diamond and has a large amount of journals. And they've been able to promote their own language, which is Portuguese and Spanish, and work with university. But it's a large infrastructure that is supported by many organizations that researchers see as value. And whenever you publish there, it is accepted that you have published your work in a credible space. So as the continent, we haven't reached that space, how the NRENs, the universities and funders and the academies, how we get together and build something like that, that will support the community, instead of having fragmented infrastructure that we cannot fund financially, where you then start having a small repository that eventually doesn't get maintained, and so on and so on. So this is just my input on this question. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Noct. And just real quick in terms of a follow-up, I mean, it sounds like a great example of how we can learn from existing systems in other parts of the world to build that structure and framework across the continent. Are those then, in Mexico, for example, are they then, those publishing is sort of in the Diamond open access space, it is then used for research assessment and assessment for researchers, and then therefore funding, access for funding through the national system?
I think within Latin America, it has been accepted that if you publish within readily sort of publishing, it is an accepted peer-reviewed system, so it doesn't have as much stigma, for lack of better word, than if you publish within the Diamond system in the continent, because they have built this credible system, and most of these journals are also from university journals, associations, so they're not just journals, so they have this built within community that is part of Reda League, and I really admire what they've built on, especially on the Diamond, and this is why I think in the continent, the space that the entrants like Ubuntu and Wakran can help with connectivity, with infrastructure, and also what we as funders, not just looking, because they are also funded within the EC programs with GIAN. So we also need to play a role to kind of support them also to have sustainable infrastructures within the continent and how we combine this. South Africa, for example, has a supercomputer in Cape Town. Morocco has one. How do we combine all this to build and support digitization of our journals? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Knox. Yes, Susan, I was going to come to you, and I know you want to add on to this, but maybe also just in the interest of time, I know it's always so hard to get through so much detailed discussion in such a short space of time, but if you could touch on that sort of, I know you wanted to bring up the concept around repositories, national or institutional repositories. So if you could touch on that too, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
Thank you. I first want to kick off with preprints. You know, we must be careful not to be everything to everybody all the time. And we must really understand what is it that African researchers want. What is it that the researchers in Africa will support at the moment? Sort of piggybacking on Knox's inclination, you know, that it is actually the researchers dictating us, you know. And that's a very important point, because we've just completed the study, and early next year we will have something similar like that, where we will launch the results of the study, where we actually found, and we did this study in collaboration with Argentina, and so it's a South American questionnaire, etc., which we mimicked firstly in South Africa through the NRF, but then we decided, no, we're going to make it much larger to the rest of Africa. And the finding was that the researchers at this point in time is just not interested in preprints. And we can see that there have been huge services that has been rolled out for researchers in Africa, open research repositories, etc., and they're just not taking off. So when are we just going to stop a little bit and just say, okay, but there are other things that we can promote for the moment that will enhance and fast track on openness and equity, etc. So I think we must not just promote and advocate open access and all its different pillars just for the sake of advocating for it. We must be clear as to what is it that Africa and South Africa particularly need. So I really want us to understand that very important principle. And just to say publicly now is that preprints is not very attractive. There are pockets, let me just be clear. Within high energy physics, which participates in very large collaborations with Switzerland and with CERN, etc., you know, where it's very necessary and they get rewarded. And the journals in which they publish, you know, there's a whole system around high energy physics in terms of open science and open access. So let's just be clear, preprints is not very attractive for researchers. And now you ask me, and then yes, of course, I think it's very important. We, as a continent, if we think about centralized open infrastructures, we must decide what is it again, what we want. I mean, the South Americans have decided what they want, and they have certainly diversified in the solutions as to what they want. Is it problematic? Well, it's debatable. And then it opens up this whole issue around diamond open access. And I think we're really in the infant shoes where we start talking about that. And where there is not consensus on what a diamond open access journal should comply with. Through the IFL, the Electronic Information for Libraries, they did a huge study on diamond open access across Africa. And it's clear, and you will see the challenges that the different publishers are actually faced with because of not support, not of having actually access to funding and some centralized sort of thinking and resource rollout specifically. So that's my second idea. So in terms of repositories, you know, again, if I go back way back to 2002 when I started in the open access field and working with IFL to bring it to South Africa because it was not a very common concept in South Africa as yet. We started with repositories because that was the easiest. And there was very quick and early adoption by institutions, by universities, by research institutions to have a repository because it was seen as a very easy way is to deposit your post-publication. It depends, of course, on the publisher, what you can deposit, but it was an easy way to fast track and to give access to information, etc. There were huge community of practice groups. There were huge IT support groups. There were quite a bit of funding from institutions to fund their repositories. But if I look at it now, how many years? 20 years down the line, where are we now? It's a very decentralized initiative at the moment. And I'm not always convinced that the institutions actually support their repositories the way they should. And typical like technology, you know, technology just in terms of complexity increases from one year to another. It's highly complex to keep a repository in an open source environment running. I just take it for our small application here at ASSAf, what we have to put in place just to keep it running. And if there's upgrades, it nearly brings down the whole system. And what we have to do then to make sure that the system keeps running. So at one point, like I said, there were many initiatives where we try to sort of centralize, because the repository software do allow you to have federation of all these repositories. And now we don't even have federation anymore. We don't even have federation across Africa repositories. So what do we need to revive that particular action or activity that's branded under open access? It needs, again, investment. It needs awareness. It needs training. It needs support. It needs us to centralize and to pool our efforts. Otherwise, even this very important effort or activity will not come to fruition for us on the continent as such. So we've got problems. There are tensions within open access, and we have to recognize those tensions. But the question remains, how do we resolve it? And I still think through collaboration, to put our funding towards one place, to train and to incentivize, to reward, not monetary incentivization necessarily, but just for systems to be in place to recognize when a researcher has participated, etc. There are many ideas out there. We talked about the other day, and I found it quite fascinating. We had a session, a webinar on the reformation of research assessment systems with the Netherlands, with the Dutch, with KNAW, which is our counterpart in the Netherlands. And they were looking at PhD students where they said part of their evaluations is what impact their research has, of course, but also to give them experience. And I thought that was quite clever because they are encouraging their PhD students just to publish, not necessarily in high impact factor journals, but to give them the experience how to publish. And if you get a peer review, what do you do? If it's very critical, how do you start engaging with a journal editor and with the peer reviewers? And what does it mean? And how do you select a journal? And I thought, you know, that's the type of incentivization we should start looking at, targeted, of course, to the very different research groups. Let me stop there. Thank you, Leanne.
Great, thanks, Susan. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time, not much, but we have a little bit of time for some audience Q&A. So if anyone would like to put up their hand and put on your video and come in, join our discussion, please do so. No problem, Knox. We'll see if we've got some Q&A for you we can get done quickly. And Alice, is there anything you want to highlight from the Q&A chat? In the absence of anyone.
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat that either of the speakers feel able to, they can type, or we could maybe kind of draw them together into a question. One was around maybe some of the potential drawbacks of requiring diamond open access publication, whether that limits academic freedom, and whether anyone would like to respond to that. And then there's also one around specifically for Dr. Ongul around the needs assessment and whether there was a different understanding of open access in Uganda compared to, say, UNESCO. So we can speakers can either take those up, or maybe if anyone feels able to briefly highlight a response to that in plenary.
I'll probably go and jump on it, Alice, especially on the academic freedom and publishing as a whole, not just Diamond. I find it very fascinating. And then my question slowly has become that if a public funder, which is public money, they are not saying you cannot publish where you want. They're saying that the money from the taxpayers should not, if let's say, for example, pay for APCs, and you should publish the work open access. It doesn't stop you from putting the pre-publishing in a repository. It doesn't stop you doing these things. It's just that if we would have thought in another space that is not academic, if a public entity accept money, how the money is used, there is should be a way that the government can kind of say what the money is used for, and it should be used better, and what is impactful for the whole society. So if you then go back and thinking of knowledge as a public good, and this is where then the essence comes back. Do we think of knowledge as a public good, or is it for a few that academics can decide based on their freedom, where they then infringe on other people's freedom, that they can decide what to do with the knowledge produced with public money? If they get different philanthropy or other organizations, then that can be dictated to. And then I think that would be one question. It has nothing to do with Diamond. It could be repositories. It could be different things. In France, for example, all the research agencies are mandated that they should put something in a national repository, which is called HAL. If you are using public money, you should put it there. You can publish wherever you want, but the preprint must go in that particular system. So these are the nuances that researchers and government needs to kind of find the balance between everybody's right, but good public use for public funds for public good. And my last question, I will probably attempt, that was here on the chat, was about, I think, funding systems. I think the funding landscape system, this is why I think we should think of it as a system, because sometimes we only think about the APC part right on top. But remember, the program has already been funded at the beginning as a whole project, and then you just now doing an additional fund, and then you have infrastructure, you have all these other things that are part of the system. So we need to think about funders, that they also have to decide where to put the money, but it's of course important to disseminate knowledge. So how do you make knowledge as part of the research process that it is funded for, but not funded for at the top, where you then kind of promote commercial use, but how do you fund from the beginning and providing the infrastructure in the holistic system to make researchers be able to do this? But it comes back to what Susan had pointed out, is again, is research assessment, is willing to use these other things that are out there that are not giving them this proxy that they are so used to, and this is what they want. So it is it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. And until we solve the research assessment question, I think open science will be very hard to implement. I will stop there and disappear into my next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Knox. And yeah, we won't give you the chance to give your final words. I think those were your final words. So thank you so much for your participation in the panel. I'm happy for you to sign off as need be. Dr. Ongul, I think there was the second question to you related to if there was any difference in the UNESCO needs assessment process within Uganda.
Thanks. Yeah, so there was not much difference with the UNESCO needs assessment. I think what we just did was like a form of early engagement and buy-in, where we were saying, okay, this is what open science looks like. This is the matrix and the like. And when you look at it in relation to your institution or what you are doing, do you think that that's something is helpful? This is what UNCST wants to do. Do you think it's the right track? Is it something that you can carry on and the like? So basically, that's what we did. But generally, they understood the UNESCO Open Science policy. But I think the issue was to domesticate and make the institution and other stakeholders understand, and then just not to make sure that open science has just popped up. And then I would just like to make a very short comment on responsible research assessment. Now, when you look at the context of Uganda, we have a very young population, so quite a number of upcoming scientists, and these are people who are getting into building their research life. And then sometimes it's even quite challenging to publish in those high impact journals and the like. And as one of the previous speakers mentioned, getting, I think that was Susan, getting into the art of publishing, how to engage with the editors and the like, it's something that is very critical. However, the buy-in from universities and academic institutions on the open responsible research assessment has been a bit challenging, and they still use the traditional method, publish or perish. And that, of course, is making a lot of young researchers leave the scientific field and go on to other areas. So that's something which, of course, the knowledge is there, but at policy level and the like, the traction is still a bit challenging, and it is having a negative impact on young and upcoming researchers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ongul. I'll take that as well as your final comments, and yeah, really appreciate that additional. Dr. Songu, is there any other questions that came out through the discussion that I didn't turn to you that you would like to comment on, and any other comments from you for your final 1 minute summary?
All right, thank you. I think it has to go for the analysis of open science. You know, when we had the symposium, national symposium, reflecting more on the UNESCO guideline, there were huge priority areas. But as a country, we decided to take, for the period, we decided to focus on 4: policy, capacity building, infrastructure for open science, and also incentives. So within the next 3 years, that's going to be our focus based on input from the STI ecosystem. So that's the key area that came from. Not in the all aware, they agree with the UNESCO, but we can't complete all. So we selected things that are more relevant to the country. And also when it comes to research, you know, the Science Granting Council has been working with universities to make sure that we focus on research that creates national impact. The country has a national priority for the next 6 to 10 years. So we encourage researchers to focus on areas like agriculture, energy, emerging technologies, and health. So, I mean, those are the areas the the granting council meet researchers, to make sure that we do research to add to the national development agenda, which is working quite closely because it brings it aligns researchers to even the national development and the government institution. In the past, researchers were not quite involved in government priorities. But if we focus on the national development agenda and we align our researchers to make sure that the research they do is adding impact to national development, I think that one will be quite useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Songu. And last but very much not least, Susan, thank you. A few final comments from you as well.
Thank you, Leanne. You see that for punishment, my surname starts with a V, so I'm used to being lost. No, just joking. And thank you very much. We've come such a long way if we really look at all the stories. And if we start mapping what's already happening on the Africa continent, let alone in South Africa, such a lot is happening, but they're all decentralized. So the question still remains, and we've been asking this question ourselves for about the last 5 years. How should we unite? How should we collaborate? How should we put forces together so that we can fulfill on all these sort of mandates of open access, etc.? Such a lot of work still to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I think we are at time, so I won't say too much in terms of the summary and sort of final comments. But I think that thinking through what you just mentioned, Susan, we've got so much more to do. And then reflecting on Knox's discussion right at the beginning around the opportunity we have with the Global Research Council meeting in Thailand in May next year, and we'll focus on open access and open science. How do we come together as a collective to really push the agenda forward, potentially with some real practical solutions of what we can trial and test at different levels and how we can collaboratively see this vision through. So without further ado, thank you everybody for participating, for staying on for the length of the call. A huge thank you to the panelists for all their time and insights and expertise. And a big thank you to INASP team who have done a lot of that great research that you saw at the beginning. You've got the links in the chat as well to those articles, so please do follow up with the team. And thank you so much, Susan and the ASSAf team for hosting us for this morning's discussion.
It's our pleasure. Thank you all. Much appreciated. Until we meet again, thank you.
Exactly.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your
Have a great day all.
participation.
Thank you.